All right, welcome to lesson 4 of the AI development course. This lesson is going to sort of start picking up speed, and that's how these lessons are going to go from here on out, is they're going to really start building on each other and more in just a conceptual way. So if you need to take a break, watch one, sit on one for a while, digest, that's totally fine. So we're going to jump right into lesson 4 here, which is all about making Aider super consistent. Right now with our projects, we have been, just using this single file that is doing all of the work for us, which is fine. This is a very simple file, but this isn't really a realistic view of what actual code bases look like. There's several files, several dependencies, a lot of stuff going on. So it's important that when we start building out bigger projects, that the code that we're writing and using Aider to write is super consistent and super up to our own standards. There's going to be a few different parts of making Aider really consistent and really powerful, and that's going to be the developer guide, linting, and testing. And we're going to cover all those here so you can make big multi-file changes with ease using Aider, having the confidence that's going to make those changes in the way that you want. So let's jump right into the developer guide. So the developer guide is a lot like this Scratchpad methodology that we've been using. However, this is a file that you can custom make. I have a template here that'll be in the GitHub repo. So again, just clone that GitHub repo. This will be in there. And basically I go through in every project that I do, and I will fill out this developer guide as I'm working on bigger changes and just getting a better sense for the project. So I do a lot of Python coding. So this is already set up for Python. And I'll sort of walk through here the different sections of this developer guide. And you can think of the developer guide as something that is literally a guide for how the LLM should be developing your project. So this is how you make it very consistent. You can set your own standards here. You can personalize this, have it be whatever you want it to be. But we can go ahead and jump into what's actually going on in this guide. So I like to put a table of contents at the top just for my understanding and for the understanding of the LLM. I think this is helpful. Again, you can take this and customize it however you want. These are just aspects and concepts that I think work best, but there's no exact science with this stuff. If you have a better way of organizing it that you think better communicates the information you're looking for, totally fine. Edit this as much as you will. This is sort of just a jumping off point. So we have this table of contents here, and moving into the next section, we have this base prompt and preferences. The base prompt you can think of as sort of a one-sentence overview of the entire project. So I've gone ahead and filled in this base prompt here. Like I said, just a super simple sentence that just primes it for the rest of the developer guide, just gets you ready for what's coming next. So very simple application for doing data analysis on Wikipedia articles. Super simple description of the project, but that's all we're looking for right here. Okay, so we have the code preferences here next. So the code preferences are really up to you, and these are your preferences of how you want your code to actually be written. This is a Python project. We're going to do all of this in Python. So these, of course, apply to Python. So we have language, which is Python, of course, package manager, pip, which we installed in the first episode or the first lesson, and then testing, which is we're going to be using PyTest for our testing, and I'll get into that a little bit later, and our documentation. So Google style doc strings is just a sort of industry standard way of doing documentation, commenting on your code. So I like the Google style doc strings. I think it helps to use, we'll see what these look like, but it helps to have extra context in your code for the LLMs to actually understand, what the function does, what the file does, all of that. So we'll talk more about that when we actually are writing larger amounts of code. Right here we have the project architecture. So Aider has this cool feature. Let me boot up Aider here. So Aider has this nice feature where if I make sure everything is added to my Git repository, because Aider and Git work very close together, I can run this /map command, and I can see how Aider understands this project. So we can see here, this is the exact prompt that it's getting surrounding all of the files here. So it's able to see the developer guide, able to see this README, and it looks like this Wikipedia fetcher, .py, our main code, it understands that this file exists with these specific functions inside of it. So every time Aider is getting a prompt from me, it's using this map to best answer that. So this is super handy. When you get into projects that are dozens, hundreds of files large, it's important that you have a good grasp on this project architecture. So, like I said, Aider has its own map feature, which is great. However, if you want to define what your project architecture looks like, say there is a front end to this application, I can talk about the front end, what goes into the front end, what goes into the back end, everything like that. This is a great place for that. Right now, we don't have a very complicated project architecture, so I can just say Wikipedia fetcher.py. Yeah, so I can just add the single file that we're using here. And as we develop this project a little bit more, we can come back in and update this. Okay, moving on into the implementation patterns. So this, again, is a very important part, just because this is how you avoid those problems with linting and testing, which we'll talk about in a bit. But this sort of really makes your code standard, really makes the naming conventions dialed in, which is super handy. Aider is already pretty good at being consistent with this, but just giving it these extra 4-5 lines of exact specifics on how to use naming conventions really helps when you get into making several projects or several files, because, having these private, for example, private variables with this leading underscore is something that is super important when you are, a dozen files in. It's really important to have this consistent, just so you can better understand your code, and so can Aider, of course. We have the documentation down here again, probably not necessary if we already have it up here, but I like to really emphasize the documentation style, just because if Aider sees it twice, there's a better chance that it's going to actually follow through with using the Google-style doc strings. So we also are including type hints right here, which basically just give a description of what is actually going into and coming out of the function. So what kind of variables are being inputted and being outputted. All right. And some other stuff here, just some type annotation. This is just really covering our tracks. You can dig more into type annotation and these, larger Python concepts. However, right now, you just need to know that this allows Aider to understand what variables are doing very easily without having to search an entire file or search an entire code base to look for different instances of that variable. Okay, and the last thing I like to add here in the developer guide is error handling. Error handling is super important, especially when you start building projects that are going to be released, going to be in production. Other people are going to be using these. So having proper error handling is super, super important. This just allows for consistency in when something does go wrong. Does it stop your program? Does it keep your program running? What's the message you see here? Do you get other logs involved with that? Can you trace it back? If you didn't have good, proper error handling and a consistent guideline for Aider for writing error handling code, you would end up, with your program stopping at random spots, and it's really hard to debug. So this just really is a quality of life thing. As well as with security, this I think could be obviously developed on more, but for right now, this is fine. And this is just some industry standards right here. So yeah, and this is a relic from another project. So I'm gonna get rid of that last line there. But you can see here, just some simple security things, just best practices to get used to this, even though, we're not gonna be putting this Wikipedia fetcher up online or anything for other people to use. There's not gonna be any money involved in this, but it's always good to just have those security guidelines in place as a habit in this developer guide. All right, so I've just done one more pass over the developer guide here and have done a little bit of editing, just simplified it down to our exact project. This will be the version that you're seeing in GitHub. So, just make sure that this fits your project, fits your goals. I thought it would be worthwhile to demonstrate sort of what a more verbose developer guide looks like. So this is for a website that I'm creating called TeachNiche, but basically this is a full stack website with a front end, back end, and full scale testing, integration with Stripe and Vimeo and all these other services. So a much more complicated project than this Wikipedia tool that we're building here. And just to demonstrate here how important these developer guides are, I won't go into details of what's actually being talked about here in this developer guide, But you can see here, this is a 400 line plus file that just goes into the specifics of how, I want my backend, how the front end should be, what packages we're using, what technologies we're using. So if you don't include this into Aider is going to be starting from scratch, trying to figure it all out, in addition to figuring out your problems or the, things you're trying to have it implement. So it's super important to have this developer guide for very consistent code writing. And this makes it easy when I go into a file and I want to make a quick change or implement a new feature. Aider knows exactly how the rest of the project works without having to dig in to understanding, what does the performance testing look like, or what is our testing strategy, anything like that. It knows what this all looks like before it even starts coding. So this is super, super helpful. It's sort of like an employee onboarding or something like that. So really, really powerful stuff here. All right, so moving on from the developer guide here, we can jump into the next section of having Aider write super consistent, super accurate code, which there's two concepts involved in this, linting and testing. And these are both rabbit holes. You can go as far as you want into understanding how each of these works, how to actually use them in production level quality code. However, for the purposes of this, linting is basically just making sure that there's no syntax errors, missing imports, things like that, things that can really snowball and cause a project to get out of control with errors and error handling. So linting is automatically done by Aider. If you have been using Aider up until this point, you might have noticed a few times it stops, tries to fix linting errors. You have to confirm this. This is a great feature in Aider, and other coding assistants won't have this. So this automatic linting is super, super powerful just because it makes your code super consistent and avoids, like I said, those errors that can really snowball super easily. So testing as well, and we'll write some tests for this project here, but testing is basically just breaking your code into smaller parts and creating unit tests to make sure that the smaller parts all work in unison, but also individually. So super, super important feature in production level code. Like I said, linting and testing are both rabbit holes. You can go as far as you want into researching them, digging more into it, digging more into Aider, how Aider does it. I'd recommend the Aider website. But for right now, just know that linting and testing are both aspects of coding that we are going to start implementing into our projects from here on out. Now that we have our developer guide set up, we have a good idea of what we're looking for with linting and testing. Let's go ahead and actually put this developer guide to use. So within the developer guide here, we have this project architecture, which, right now we just have this single file that we're using. However, let's go ahead and add a new file because right now our code is handling the fetching and the visualizations and the data analysis. So let's break this into multiple files and get into a little bit more complicated coding. So back here in the developer guide, I can go ahead and just specify some new files that I want to create. All right, so back here in the developer guide, we can go ahead and specify our project architecture to include a couple more files. Just since, right now this Wikipedia fetcher is handling the fetching of the articles, the processing of the text, the analyzing of the text, the visualizations, all that stuff. So it'd be nice if this was broken up into more files just for easier organization. So here in the developer guide, under the project architecture, I can go ahead and just specify which new files I want to add. Okay, so I've gone ahead and I've added these two new files that I want just to the developer guide here. So I can even specify to Aider that these are going to be new files. Let's go ahead and clear out our context with Aider just to make sure. And I'm going to add this developer guide as a read-only file to Aider. And I'm going to make reference to this project architecture. So right here, we have the read-only, the developer guide is in here. So Aider is primed with all of our instructions to make very consistent code. So I'm going to say, give Aider a simple prompt here just to break the file into 3 different files as opposed to just this one large file doing all of the work. I've gone ahead and I've just written a super simple prompt here, but I want to emphasize that as we get into using multiple files and having more and more complexity in our project and in our prompts, it's very important that you remember that clear communication is most important. So you can think about this as sort of, you want to specify where something is happening, what that thing is, what that thing that you're changing is, and how to actually change it. So right here, I'm saying, I want to create these new files, articleanalysis.py, articlevisualizations.py, and then within Wikipedia fetcher.py, so I'm very specific with my location here, I want to refactor it so that it only contains the Wikipedia API functionality. And then within article analysis and visualizations, or in article visualizations, I'm specifying, the code that I want to go into both of those. So, this could be improved on for sure, but for right now, this is a pretty small file, and I feel confident that Aider will be able to figure out what I'm getting at here. Now we'll see also, since we have this developer guide in here, if it redoes our documentation, and so if these concepts actually carry over into the code base. So I'll go ahead, select this prompt, add Wikipedia fetcher to the chat, and we'll let this run and see if it's able to properly separate our code base. Okay, awesome. So Aider just finished up refactoring our project, splitting it up into a couple different files. So we can go here and just take a look at what has changed. So our Wikipedia fetcher, as we requested, now only contains code for getting Wikipedia articles and saving them to markdown files, which is great. It looks like it may have missed a comment up here, which is totally fine. You can see we have this new Google style documentation from our developer guide. I didn't specify this in the prompt. This is purely from the developer guide. So pretty cool that that worked. I was able to make that change. And this is now a very simple file. We can jump into article analysis over here and check out what the changes are over here. So Aider just created this new file, and it looks like, we have that documentation that we specified, and all of our analysis tools are over here for getting total words, unique words, etc. Our visualizations also have that Google style documentation, which is great. And it looks like it compiled this all into a single function. I didn't specify how I wanted this file to be done, so that's not ideal, but that is fine for right now. It's a pretty easy fix with Aider. So right now, we have that bar chart and the word cloud. So let's go ahead and actually run this project, and I will do it on the city of Seattle. That's where I live. So let's give this a run. Awesome. So looks like that worked great. Everything is still working as expected. We have this whole article on Seattle. We have our word cloud. We have our word frequencies, and we have all the statistics right where we left off with lesson 2, or lesson 3 rather. So there we go. That is still working great. It was able to successfully split all of those files up with their specific code and functions and all of that. So looking really good. Aider was able to do this. I can head back over into my developer guide here. Now that these files have been created, I can just go ahead and remove them, these new tags on them. So there we go. Everything is looking super, super solid. Now that we are able to successfully split up our Wikipedia fetcher into multiple files, what we're going to go ahead and do is develop some unit tests for this function. So for right here, let's create a test for fetch Wikipedia article and just make sure that this is working. Obviously, we can just run our program and see that the Seattle, for example, the seattle.md file was created, and it's actually full of the correct Wikipedia article. However, it's good to get in the habit of writing unit tests with Aider for features like this. So I'll go ahead and craft up a little prompt here just so we can get ready and develop a PyTest suite for this. So I've gone ahead here and I've added Wikipedia fetcher to the chat, and I'm giving it this simple, 6-word prompt. Create new unit test for fetch Wikipedia article. So I'm being very specific here by referencing this exact function name, fetch Wikipedia article. And I can go ahead and send this off. And since we, in our developer guide, have the testing, we're going to use PyTest for this. And we sort of go into detail on how errors should be handled and all of that. It should be able to successfully write this test, no problem. Okay, so we can see here, Aider went ahead and created this new test directory, as well as this new file, test Wikipedia fetcher. So this is just sort of standard how these things go. We can double check all of the code in here. It's super important that as you start writing production level code with tests, that you also understand what all the tests are looking for, what you're actually testing for. In this example, Aider is using these things called mocks. So this is, setting up mock pages for Wikipedia just so it doesn't actually have to call the API every time. However, in some applications, you might not want these mocks. Like if your front end is calling the back end, you probably don't want to mock that. You want to actually understand and verify that the connection between them is working, for example. So you can, in your developer guide, very easily set up a new section here for, say, testing guidelines and tell it to avoid mocks. There is a lot of good information out there on how to best write unit tests with tools like Aider. So I'd recommend digging deeper into that. For the purposes of this tutorial, we are basically just going to go with what Aider wrote here. You can see, it gave me some commands here to go ahead and run. I did go ahead and run those, and it looks like we hit an error right away. So this is totally typical. It's having trouble finding the Wikipedia fetcher module. So it's just a simple import error. Aider is going to be able to fix this hopefully pretty quickly here. So I'm going to just add this error to the chat and just describe it, asking Aider to go ahead and fix that. I can even just copy and paste this main part of the error here, just paste that in there. And Aider has the context, it understands that it just wrote this test, and look at that. Super simple fix. It's going to go ahead and add this new init file, and let's go ahead and run this shell command and see what happens. So we're getting another error here. Attempted import with no parent package. Again, just some simple bullet points or some simple errors. So let's see if we can figure this out. Awesome. So Aider was able to solve the import errors that we were having earlier, and I didn't have to do too much for that. Just copy and pasting the error back into Aider. It just didn't quite do it right the first time, so no problem. We can see here that our tests actually did run. So we have this failed test and a pass test, which is perfect. It's okay if the test is failing because, the test and the code should be working together. So maybe the test is behind, maybe there's a problem with the test, or maybe there's a problem with the code that the test just found out for us. So again, super handy that I can just add this to the chat, and again, just take this failed line, copy and paste it into Aider, and Aider will be able to figure out what's going on here and how to solve it. Awesome. So it was just a quick fix here. Again, I just copy and pasted the failed test description into Aider, and Aider was able to fix it in a single go. So now we have both those tests passing, which is great. That's exactly what we're looking for. We don't have to add that to the output. We can go ahead and clear out our chat window here and drop all of these files. Okay, so up until this point, we have talked about the developer guide. We've talked about writing more consistent code with Aider, using testing and the linting principles to really have Aider hone in on writing good, consistent code. So let's go ahead and take a look here at the Aider config file. So let me move down my terminal here and just showcase the Aider config file. So head over to Aider chat right here at this link, the config, aiderconfig.html. You can see they have this sample YAML config file. So let's break down what's actually happening with this config file and how powerful this really is for your project. Okay, so I'm here in my project with that aiderconfig.yaml sample file from the Aider website. I've just copy and pasted it into this new aider.config.yaml file. So Aider is going to automatically recognize that this is the config file it's looking for. So let's go ahead and break down some of the options that you have here. There are a ton of things going on in this file. I would highly recommend you dig deeper into each and every one of these sections, each and every one of these features, and really take a close look at what Aider is capable of doing with this configuration file. So this first section here, we can always see our main model. So we can specify the default model that we want to use every time we boot up Aider. So if you are really a fan of Sonnet, you can have it always boot up with Sonnet without having to use that model flag. So this is super handy. I like to change my models quite often, so I have all of this just set to false, so I can change and specify every time I run Aider. You can set your OpenAI keys here, or any API key that you have. You can just set them directly in the config file. So this is really handy if you are switching between projects and you like your Aider instance set up in a very specific way, you can just copy and paste this config file from one project to the other. And keeping your API keys in here just reduce the amount of times you have to create that new .env file. You can see here you can set multiple of them, which is great. You have this model settings section here, which you can go ahead and configure the settings for the specific model. Again, I would point you towards the Aider website if you want to dig more into setting up the settings, setting up metadata for Aider. All of these sort of things are pretty advanced, and I would recommend, if you want to research them, using the Aider website to really dig into what is possible here. We have reasoning effort. This is a new feature with OpenAI's O3. We can specify architect mode. This is something we'll talk about in the next lesson, architect mode, but you can default to the specific mode that you want to use. You can set your weak model, which is used for chat history and commit messages, just like it says here. So if you want to use a different model for those things, save you some money, totally fine. You can go about doing that. You can specify the editor model within the architect, which is fine. Show model warnings. This is default to true. I would recommend keeping this on. So here we go. 150 lines in, this is the first thing that I have configured, and that is caching of prompts. So some models will allow you to cache prompts in the API cloud, and this just reduces the cost that you have to put into calling the API. So if you have prompts cached up there, it'll do it automatically. It'll just save you a little bit of money. So this is only available with some models. However, I have it turned on just in case I'm using a model that has caching abilities. It'll automatically use that. Right here, we have a repo map. So we saw earlier, in Aider, I can use that /map command, and it'll show us a little bit of our project map, just like that. So you can choose how many tokens you want this to use. The default is around 1,000, I believe. So you can set this to whatever you think is appropriate for your project. If you have a very large project, it's a good idea to have a large, bumping this up a little bit, just so Aider has more context. Again, if you want to learn more about this, you can dig into the Aider website and really figure out what's going on. Beneath that, some history files. These are these automatic files that Aider creates when we run it for the first time in any project. So we don't need to worry about those. We can head down into output settings if you have, a preference for using dark mode, light mode, streaming or not streaming. There's a ton of options here for configuration. I mean, you can set every color for everything that Aider is writing, which is super fun. There's a few different themes that you can choose from. I am just going to keep on the default one, but if you want, you can mess around with that. The Git settings here, I would recommend keeping these in the default unless you know what you're doing here. So we're looking for that GitHub repository at the beginning of every project. And if it's not there, creating it, which is super handy for our purposes of creating a lot of smaller projects during this tutorial. So there is an option for an Aider ignore file. So if you would rather have a git ignore file as well as a Aider ignore file, files that Git can see but Aider can't, you can specify that here. So this is super important. The auto commits command here is worth pointing out. As Aider is writing code, it's actually committing to Git. So when I push to GitHub, all of these changes will be pushed with it, all these commits. I prefer having this on because this way we can easily undo changes in our code and go back to every specific version that we've had. However, some people will turn auto commits off and do their commits by hand. That's totally an option you have. So that's configurable. Moving on into fixing and committing, we have a few important settings here. So linting, as we talked about earlier, you can set it up so that it just runs lint right away. You can specify your linting commands to use different linting styles. So I prefer just the default one. It looks and works pretty good for me. But if you have a specific way that you like to lint your code, you can specify all of that here. Auto lint is set to true. You can turn that off if you'd like. I would recommend keeping this on. And then we can go into the test command. So you can see here, since we set up those unit tests, all it takes is running PyTest. So I have set PyTest to my test command. And I've also toggled this auto test feature to true. So what this does is automatic testing after changes. So every time we make an update to our code, Aider is going to run a test. Okay, so we're able to configure our testing, use auto test, set up the testing command so that every time it makes a change, it's going to run some tests. which is super fun or super easy for debugging. So moving on, we have, analytics, upgrading. These are more internal. I don't mess with these too much. If you want to, have more analytics, have more logs, you're free to do that. It's right there. Upgrading is just for, as you would guess, updating Aider if there's a new version. There is a section on the modes here. So you can see Aider has a user interface if you want to use that, which will open a website or a page in your browser to use Aider in your browser. I prefer to use it in the terminal, but if you want to use the GUI, you are free to do so. Aider has a voice option. So if you want to use your voice for Aider to voice control all of it, you are totally able to do that. You can just configure that right here. And finally, into this last section here, we have one of the most important aspects of this config file, which is setting up read-only files by default. You can set up files that will automatically be added to the chat every time you run Aider, and those will be editable. However, what I like to do, since we have developed this developer guide, is I will use this read configuration in the config file to have the developer guide be loaded up as a read-only file every time I start Aider. So this is super handy for making sure that the code that you're writing is super consistent and following that developer guide every time that you run Aider. Moving through, there's a few other options here at the bottom. You can dig into all of these options, like I said, with the Aider website. For right now, these are the configs that I have changed. Pretty simple. Just setting up that testing, setting up that read-only, caching the prompts, and that is about it. So I can save this file and move into my terminal and demonstrate this config file actually at use. So let me go ahead and specify my model here. And I'm also going to add this config flag and just type in that name of the file. So I can do Aider, and I'm just pressing tab to autocomplete here. So aiderconfig.yaml, and I can send that off. And now you can see it jumped into using the developer guide read-only automatically, which is great. And we can see that the other configuration files or the other config options have also come into play. So let's go ahead and, as we wrap up this lesson, tie it all together by having a change to our Wikipedia fetcher and the test automatically run. So I will add Wikipedia fetcher to the chat, and I will go ahead and just say enhance the documentation of this file. So this is a super simple change. I'm not actually changing any of the functionality here, just updating the documentation. So we can see here, it's running through, updating the comments, and you can see after it made those changes, asked me if I wanted to run, it went ahead and automatically ran our test suite. So this ran our PyTests. You can see this passed, which is great. And this is automatically added to the Aider chat. So Aider can see, if those tests all failed, you can just ask it to go ahead and complete those tests. So this is super handy for just making Aider super consistent in how it's actually coding and making debugging much easier, much simpler. So very nice that worked right away. All right, so we have moved through the developer guide. We have talked about linting. We've talked about PyTest. We have separated our project into a couple different files, as well as setting up testing for our Wikipedia fetcher. So we've done quite a bit in this lesson. I would recommend taking some time, walking through everything again, making sure you have a good grasp on the developer guide, how to use Aider to separate files and do multi-file changes. I would also recommend working through that config file, messing around with some of the options in there, seeing if there's anything that you want to adjust that I didn't change, and doing some research on the Aider website for all of those configuration options. So again, things are going to pick up from here. Lesson 5, we're going to go into the architect mode and digging into how to really make significant code changes with Aider. So again, take your time with this stuff. Really feel like you understand what's going on here, because things are going to pick up fast and we are going to be coding very rapidly moving forward.